This video is going to bring out some of the key learnings from that consensus statement. And I'm going to begin by telling Ben's story, then go on to interview other people with ADHD who've also suffered from substance misuse, but they've thankfully recovered and are still alive to tell their own tales. So this is Ben. He was a really happy, outgoing, gregarious small child, full of life and fun. We had never heard of ADHD, and there are probably still parents who are not aware of it today, although it does get much more media attention nowadays than it did in the 90s. Ben was 6 in October 1996, and he was in school year 1 when the local psychological services made their first major mistake and let the family down, really. His teacher suggested to us that he may have ADHD. She was very ahead of her time, really. It was 1996. She put him forward for assessment. However, after interviews and observing him for about a term, the psychologist decided that although he did have problems with attention and concentration, he did not have ADHD. Back then, I was pleased to hear this. It was good news. Ben didn't have a debilitating hidden condition. Unfortunately, however, it was a misdiagnosis. Missed because Ben wasn't naughty, he wasn't rebellious, and he wasn't super hyperactive. He was clever, charming, and very likeable. His main problem was inattention. His mind wandered. He was so forgetful, and he didn't want to start doing challenging tasks. Although he did suffer problems at primary school with bullying, mainly social bullying, he was generally happy at primary school because the school worked very well to support his individual needs, regardless of the lack of a correct diagnosis. Right from a young child, Ben was extremely sensitive to rejection, sometimes imagining rejection where none was intended. No practitioner has ever warned us that social bullying and extreme sensitivity to rejection, two factors that can combine together to create a spiral and declining self-worth, are common with ADHD. Of course, when Ben was first assessed, they made an incorrect misdiagnosis, so they couldn't have warned us then for that reason. But I know now that people are still not told about bullying or rejection sensitivity, even when they do receive a diagnosis. We certainly weren't. And I think it's important because it undoubtedly sowed the seeds of the mental health challenges that led Ben to drug abuse in his adolescence. This is Ben at age 11 when he got into the local grammar school. We were really pleased he got in there, partly because we knew the bully wasn't going. However, although he was polite and well-behaved, he really started to struggle to cope with the work there. And teachers had a lot of difficulty understanding him too. Usually, Ben didn't share much with me, but one day he came home and told me that his teacher had recently told him he needed to show more interest in class and ask more questions. So Ben did ask questions, but then she suddenly cut him off and said she couldn't deal with that many questions. He felt he couldn't do anything right. He began skipping school occasionally with tummy ache. He lost a lot of confidence socially in his academic ability as well. And he gave up acting, which he was especially good at. We'd even thought that he might go on to become an actor. And he gave up musical instruments. His father and I were both terribly worried. We hoped it was just a phase, and his teachers thought it was typical teenage rebelliousness. Ben put a manly face on everything and just said he was fine. He had problems with friendships at that secondary school for the first 2 years as well, but after that he formed a really close circle of friends. That was great, but unfortunately they were very active drug experimenters, starting with cannabis. But at least he had good friends now, and that's so important to 15-year-olds, so we hope they'd all grow out of it. As a teenager, Ben stayed polite and well-behaved. Now, I often wish he'd been disruptive because he would have got more attention. He claimed to us that he was not doing well at school because he didn't care, whatever. However, when his GCSE results came out, he was deeply disappointed because he got low to middle grades. So we realised that he truly did care about his studies. He'd been covering up with false bravado all the time, and that was a huge wake-up call to us. So we urgently sought another ADHD assessment via his GP. However, there was such a long wait for an NHS diagnosis, so Ben dropped out of sixth form after half a term. Then, to accelerate the diagnosis, we went private. So finally, at age 17, Ben was diagnosed with ADHD, and he additionally got an educational psychologist report which put his IQ at 129, i.e. in the top 4%. So he was academically gifted. By age 17, Ben had begun to distrust authority figures and he'd lost a lot of self-confidence. So when he did restart sixth form, he used ADHD meds to help his studies, although they caused him some side effects. But he was disappointed again with his AS grades, so he abandoned A-levels altogether at age 19 without completing them and became a full-time chef. He loved cooking and he'd long been a creative cook, so his first 2 jobs went very well. However, Ben felt low. Everyone else was going to university. He knew he'd underachieved. Worryingly, his teenage drug experimentation had grown. Initially it was cannabis, but now it was ecstasy and ketamine as well. Now I know that about 25% of those with ADHD self-medicate with drugs or alcohol. It's a coping strategy, but the fact is that drug or alcohol experimentation is more risky for ADHD teens than others because experimentation leads to persistent use for self-medication. So those children and their parents need to be educated about that risk when they get a diagnosis, hopefully whilst they're still young children. The consensus statement revealed that 23% of treatment-seeking individuals with SUN meet the criteria for ADHD. In fact, another study put that even higher at 31%. So since ADHD is still massively underdiagnosed, it's a good idea to screen all SUN patients for ADHD. The working world became problematic when the restaurant where he worked as a chef closed. Ben didn't settle in other chefing jobs, and he began to have mysterious pains in his chest. Ben thought it was his heart, but the GP only offered indigestion medicine. He tried ADHD medications again to help the work, but still no medication really suited him. Although this time round I felt it was a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, partly fueled by his distrust of authority figures, including psychiatrists. He was getting harder to help. The ADHD psychiatrist knew about Ben's drug abuse, and he certainly advised against it, but he never mentioned that drug misuse is frequently a problem and that there's a much higher risk of addiction for those with ADHD. And he didn't explain that repeated drugs used to self-medicate is a form of drug dependence, which could be called psychological addiction. Certainly, whenever I suggested that Ben visits our local drug abuse service, he hotly rebuffed me. He said he wasn't an addict and that service was only for severely addicted individuals. Ben just didn't see himself as like them. He believed he was managing his use to suit his needs, and he didn't ever imagine that the drugs would come to control him. Further, the practitioner didn't explain that ADHD medicine is actually protective against drug misuse either. This is something that was emphasised a lot by the consensus statement. Studies have shown that ADHD medication is protective against substance misuse, so it's important that practitioners know that, act on it, and spread the word. Although Ben's life was going downhill at this point, he could still have been pulled back, and better drugs education would have played a big part in that. After each job setback, Ben was very discouraged, spending weeks at home alone. He felt anxious and withdrawn, and he magnified everything that went wrong. He always blamed himself. Being highly sensitive to failure or rejection and self-blame are all common ADHD traits. Ben still masked his fears behind his strong and silent exterior. He thought it was unmasculine to seek help and sympathy. In 2013, he began working in factories. He wanted to save up to go travelling. They were very impressed with his strong work ethic, but Ben, couldn't say no to overtime, and he ended up working endless 70-hour weeks. He became exhausted and depressed, and the GP gave him antidepressants. Also, Ben was taking more illicit drugs, mainly on his own now, not socially. Eventually, we discovered that he'd begun using heroin. In February 2015, he accidentally overdosed, spent 2 days in a coma, and nearly died. Steve and I were desperately worried, but whenever we tried talking to him about his drug problem, Ben dismissed us angrily. He pointed out that he wasn't physiologically addicted. We felt powerless. Now his drug problem and his emotional problems totally eclipsed his ADHD. Ben went travelling in Europe that July, but he returned home after only 10 weeks, suffering panic attacks. A month later, his mental health deteriorated very rapidly, and shockingly, he attempted suicide. Afterwards, in hospital, he had 6 hours wrist surgery and was diagnosed psychotic and highly suicidal. But to our surprise, they sent him home for treatment in the community shortly after surgery. Although he'd been sent home from hospital, Ben was still highly delusional. He still had very bad chest pains, and he endlessly begged us to help him end his life. We tried talking positively, giving him love and support, but he kept coming back to suicide. It was very draining. Eventually, the NHS were forced to recognise his suicidality and to section him. Over 7 weeks in mental hospital, he was prescribed antipsychotics, but no one attempted to address the underlying cause of his suicide attempt, his drug abuse, or his ADHD. Ben was angry at losing his freedom, and he felt resentful and very misunderstood. The team appeared to only want to reach the point where he could go home. Despite having psychologists and therapists on their staff, they resisted bringing them into Ben's case. After discharge from mental hospital, I arranged for Ben to see a private psychologist, and that continued for about a year. He knew a lot about drug abuse and convinced Ben that illegal drugs were harmful, especially harmful to him. So thankfully, Ben committed to giving them up. The private psychologist also told us that Ben might never work again, or may only be able to work part-time. He'd never return to his old self now. After about 9 months, the psychologist wanted to discharge him. He said he'd done all he could. I was worried about this because the underlying issues had not been addressed. But the psychologist didn't suggest another referral. He said he thought Ben would be okay now and believed it was time for him to try life again. I can now see, looking back, that what should have happened at this point was a referral to an ADHD psychologist. But at that time, I didn't understand how specialist different practitioners are, so we didn't seek another referral. Additionally, Ben was keen to get away from mental health services altogether, and on top of that, he decided to relocate to Devon for his new start, and that made it harder to pursue specialist mental health support. He tried a furniture making course there, and then he went on to a gardening course after that, but he wasn't able to complete either of them. The reality was that it was a very fragile recovery, and although the drugs problem had gone, his lack of confidence, his ADHD, and his low self-esteem had left him very vulnerable to overreacting to life's setbacks. This is Ben on a holiday in Lundy Island. It's almost the last photo I have of Ben, because despite being a natural performer as a child, he began to hate having his photo taken in later life. He moved back to Stroud in January 2020, but he was still struggling with life, and unfortunately he began using a slow-release benzodiazepine to help manage his mood and increase his motivation. He obtained this through the dark web, and he also tried to get away from it several times later in 2020, but he couldn't. He pretended to us that he didn't want to reduce it, but after his death, we realised that his dependence on it was a huge source of anxiety to him. It overwhelmed him, and it made him feel very bad about himself. However, at Christmas, we had a big upturn. It was lovely, almost like old times. Ben watched films with us, he helped make lunch, he even played charades. So I thought things were looking up. But I was wrong. At 7 a.m. on the 27th of December 2020, I went to offer Ben a cup of tea and found a piece of paper on the floor outside the locked bathroom door. It was his suicide note, and it said, "I am long past saving and will be mostly a burden to you as long as I live." We are still horrified that Ben felt a burden. We've gone over and over his final weeks, everything that was said. At the end of his life, Ben was so far from the happy child I remember, who was excited to start school. So Ben's dead now, and nothing can bring him back. But we can all do more to prevent young people suffering tragic lives like Ben's. That completes Ben's story. To help illustrate the difficulties people face and why the consensus statement is important, I found 3 more people who face similar challenges with ADHD and substance misuse. And they've kindly and bravely agreed to tell their stories to us. So now it's time to introduce my guests.